guys, it's Mr. Andrews here. Just wanted to talk to you a little bit today about the methods section. Obviously, we've all written our methods section in draft form. We've discussed it in presentation. We've even, if you've been paying attention, read the chief reader's notes, giving you some ideas about how to improve, looking at some of the major issues that they've seen trending in previous works, and the things that really made these essays work. But I wanted to go over a live reading of one particular paper today, a design method for additive manufacturing. This was a 5-score AP research paper that you can find actually down in the sample papers today if you look for it. But I wanted to show this one because the last one I think was a little more of a social issue, and I wanted to pull up something that was more science-based for those science people. But nevertheless, I just want to give you an example of like how you could go about organizing or reorganizing your methods section. This is just one way to think about it. But there are some basic principles that we can take away from it that I'm going to try to deduce as we go through. So let's just kind of start from the top here. You can see they've centered their methods section separator. It's up to you, of course, and it's really up to, in many ways, the style conditions of whatever format you're using. This can be centered. In some cases, it might be to the left. They've opted to make it centered specifically because they're going to have subsections even within this, right? You'll see right away they got study design, and then they'll have other areas like procedures, such as ethical considerations. They'll also have their selection process as well. So let's just kind of walk through it. I'll be reading and stopping as we go. So for this study, I created an informative document outlining a design process based on existing. I think they meant to say on. There's actually a typo here, which is interesting. It's worth noting that although grammatical mistakes can be an indication of something being wrong, right? Grammar is not really everything on these, right? Obviously, it's an easy thing to fix. But at the same time, it's worth noting that the vast majority of what you're going to be evaluated in on this is actually having to do with the content, right? It's interesting to find a typo so quickly, but to know that this did score a 5, I think just points to just how much the content really matters. You'll also notice their use of first person here. I created, right? It's absolutely appropriate throughout this entire paper and this entire essay to be writing in first person, guys, and referring to the research in the first person. So based on existing scientific literature and research with experienced designers from AM companies. Originally, I wanted to analyze a specific process known as part consolidation. But if I wanted to make a new contribution to this area of research, I would have to carry out multiple case studies, which I determined I had neither the time nor resources to accomplish. So one thing you'll notice that at the beginning of their methods section, rather than just jumping right into what they decided, this author decided actually to kind of walk us through their process chronologically. In other words, they aren't just talking about the design they landed on, they're talking about their process of designing the study. That includes the thought process, that includes the candidate processes that they eventually rejected. And why did they reject them? So this is an opportunity for you too. You want to think about opening your methods section by actually providing a little bit of that reflection piece, not just reporting on what you ultimately did, but also reporting on your process of development, right? Did you originally have other ideas in mind as you developed it? How did that change or evolve? Or did you end up scrapping the whole thing and starting over, right? What did that process look like? Being able to describe the process is just as important as describing your product. All right. So after researching existing parts consolidation literature, I could not find an attainable gap to fill. I decided to expand the scope of my research and settled on creating a comprehensive, generalized design process that would highlight additive specific processes and considerations. At its most basic level, the method resembles a typical 4-step design process. First, identify requirements. Second, develop designs. Third, build a prototype. And fourth, test the prototype and evaluate performance. However, in my method, I modified each step with the appropriate design techniques and considerations that will you see, again, another typo right here, right? This isn't an English major we're talking about here. This is probably somebody who's a little more science oriented, and that's okay. Do we want typos? No. Are they forgivable? Absolutely. Take advantage of the advanced capabilities of AM and ensure cost is minimized while maximizing performance. All right, and again, we don't have context for what they mean by AM because we didn't read the introduction. However, I think we're just going to continue focusing on what's going on here with their methods. So I collected my information in two ways. First, through content analysis of research on AM-specific processes. Second, I conducted interviews with design engineers working with AM. The input from these sources would provide insight onto the current approaches to designing for AM, and I compared the information covered by each source to determine what considerations and processes were the most important to include in a final comprehensive method. So it's worth noting that they are especially connecting all of their design choices to purpose. So one of the things you may want to look through is not only are you explaining what you did in terms of your ultimate design, but are you connecting that design to your purpose? Are you coming it back to explicitly what you were trying to understand and connecting it to why you chose it in the first place? So you'll notice that once they get past just describing their design, and that was pretty short, guys, they get into selection. Now, selection could mean a lot of things for different people. Obviously, this person is doing content analysis and interviews, right? But if you're doing just straight up content analysis, right, it may be important for you to talk about what was your criteria that you applied to the information you were looking at. How did you sift out the information? How did you sort it? How did you categorize it? And how did you eventually evaluate or weigh it out? Okay. Selection could be the same thing if you were doing something like a social experiment. How did you select the people that you did? Why did you focus on the demographic of subjects that you did? There are some practical reasons you might have to offer, right? Talking about how, your limitations as a high school student, but really remember that those limitations, convenience is not a good justification. Okay. So I want to repeat that. I mentioned that before, but convenience is not a justification for your methods. Okay. So simply saying that, oh, I did this because it was easy or because it's what I could do, like that's more of a limitation, guys. That's really not a good criteria for why you designed it the way you did. So what you need to do here is make the case, whether it's in a selection section or just in your design in general, of why studying the people you did or surveying or interviewing the people you did was relevant to your purpose or goal, okay? You need to make that case because at the end of the day, whether it was convenience or not, or you were limited by your resources as a high school student, this is not the time or the place to make that. You need to make the case that even though you were limited to just interviewing SRT students, it was still relevant to answering your question, right? You still need to be making the case that despite the limitations, you were interviewing a demographic or you were looking at content that is relevant to your purpose, okay? So to collect information for the final method, I used personal interviews and existing research. Each of these sources had their own selection process. For a company to be considered, they had to have capabilities for final product production. Again, not the words are kind of strange here, right? In-house post-production and design assistance for clients. This eliminated any machine shops that simply printed a customer's product with little or no input on how to optimize their design for AM. If the company met these requirements, then any of their design engineers qualified in AM design would suffice for input for an interview. Initially, I attempted to contact companies in the geographic area throughout their websites. Unfortunately, I did not receive a response from any for further correspondence. From there, I could use personal connections through friends and family working in qualified companies to eventually found 4 current AM design engineers to correspond with. Now, it's worth noting that they gave us their due process, right? And I think hopefully they will get to a point where they're admitting the bias or the limitations of working through family and friends. But it's worth noting that they are also pointing out that they did their due diligence, right? They tried to reach out to companies to get more of a random selection of relevant people to interview. Ultimately, they weren't able to accomplish this, right? But they showed that they did their due diligence. And so one of the things is if you feel that there are limitations to who you ended up looking at or the content that you ended up analyzing, right? You need to make sure that you're justifying why you had to meet with those limitations and why you ended up having to, I guess, without a better term, settle for that particular population or that particular group of information, okay? Let's keep going. So for existing literature, I chose studies that explored a design consideration that takes advantage of AM's capabilities or proposes a new AM design method themselves. For the study to be considered, I looked for a comprehensive description and extensive quantitative data that proves the effectiveness of the process. So it's worth noting that they looked at both facets, right? They looked at both, like, what information did they select, why did they select it, how was it relevant to their purpose, right? That's our content analysis. And in this first part, they talked about how did they select their candidates for interviews. And in both cases, what they were doing, again, was making that attempt, I think successfully, to justify why those selections were purposeful. All right, ethical considerations. So one thing you may want to consider is the ethical considerations in your design, because as you were designing your methods, that really was when you were getting into the IRB. So whether or not it's its own section, they did that as their own this awkward little section. You could simply import it into another part of the section, but the study does not have any ethical considerations other than privacy. So to ensure confidentiality, I changed company names to generic company ABC and labeled interviewees as designer AD. So for some of you, it may be really important to talk about how your design was shaped or impacted by ethical considerations. And it's possible that for many of you, in a much more significant way than this student, your design really had to be remolded and reshaped for ethical reasons that maybe the IRB brought up. And so talking through that process of how it developed and how it evolved will be important. Again, not just giving us the final product, but describing that process in detail. So not just walking us through, okay, how did your method change and evolve over time because of your goals as a researcher, but how did it also shape and evolve over time because of ethical considerations? That's another piece. Finally is procedure, right? So the way that this student did it was they kind of gave us the design. They gave us, okay, how did I select who I was going to study and what I was going to study? And last but not least, they're going to walk us through now, what did I do once I was doing it? How did I execute this, right? So one way to think about designing yours then is that you could do just that. You could kind of walk us through chronologically the way that they're doing everything from the beginnings to design into the procedure itself. So here they say, for each designer, I conducted a series of 2 phone interviews. The first was for general information exchange to gain a better understanding of the application of AM within their respective communities and for them to understand the goal of my research. On the second, I administered a set of 5 questions. See Appendix G. So one thing worth noting is that you don't have to describe everything in detail in terms of like what you asked, how you asked it, et cetera, et cetera. But one really savvy move you can do is you can include the appendices like this. You can include lists of questions. Now, it doesn't have to be an exact screenshot of like your survey, say. It doesn't have to be. In fact, you could just list the questions out in an appendix somewhere, though. And that might be a way to give the reader some extra detail and insight without overwhelming them with like a bunch of examples of it or listing out all the questions, right? Or describing in detail what every question is. Instead, this would allow you to just give us the gist of like what in general was discussed, right? And then you can move on, noting that there's an appendix if they want more detail. That could be a really smart move to kind of streamline the narrative flow, the flow of this section here as you're describing the procedure. So I recorded their responses and placed them in a comparison chart. And again, this is probably their spreadsheet, right? You could provide, again, a screenshot of that maybe at the end as well. Each question, if you feel it would be relevant. Each question served as a starting point for discussion, but I expected the content of the discussion to diverge into new areas and provide information that I had never considered. For analysis of existing literature, I chose 7 studies that met the qualifications I set earlier in the methods section. Each document was put into a rubric, see Appendix E, for analysis that has 3 areas of analysis. 1, modification of the traditional design process. 2, application of additive technologies. And 3, challenges and considerations the process brings to the new design process. I took qualitative data on each source and put the information into the tracking sheet for analysis between literature sources and with the information I obtained from the interviews. Now, here's the thing worth noting here is that for you content analysis people or people who have that as part of your research, it is absolutely crucial that you don't just get into and fall into what could easily become, okay, I read a bunch of research and here's what it said. Or I was looking for this and here's what I found. It could be really easy to kind of jump from point A to point B, or point C rather, without telling us what point B was or what the middle part was. What you really need to do is give the reader a sense of What did you do with the information as you were looking at it? How did you begin to categorize it? What were you looking for as you did it? And what system did you have? What criteria did you have as you were looking through the content? Okay, so it's really important that you're not just describing what content you selected, what was your criteria for finding that content, right? But also, what were you doing with it once you had it? So really explaining what those categories were and how do they, again, tie back to the purpose, okay? How do they tie back to your goals? So there have been a few key takeaways from this. I hope this was helpful. And I think overall, a few of the major ones, just to review, that you should really be thinking about is, one, the methods section is not just about what did you end up with in terms of a product, in terms of your study, right? It's also about the process of development. So you should definitely be describing the evolution of your process. This includes your thought process. This includes the ethical considerations you had to take along the way. This also concerns some of the limitations that you had to your process, but how did you adjust your process in order to still meet your goals despite those limitations? That's really important and crucial there. The other thing is giving the reader insight into how each of your choices connected back to your purpose. So I hope that this was helpful to you guys. Reach out to me if you need anything at all. I'm happy to conference with you guys to talk about what's going on and where your thoughts are. I wish you well. Stay safe.